Well, let's talk about mermaids again. It seems to be a new topic that's swirling around and the folklore about it, and most of that is for the reason that they recently made a redo of the Disney classic and The Little Mermaid and race swapped the main person out of that. So it's becoming a little more well known, but whenever I was a kid, my first experience with what possibly was a real mermaid was reading in Ripley's Believe It or Not, and they had what ended up be called the Fiji mermaid. And after not looking in that magazine but at other research about it, they found out that it was a partial monkey, some paper mache and fish bones, and then the bottom half of a fish, and it all been kind of sutured up together to look like it was a half fish, and the other half of it was a monkey. And they had this on exhibit with Barnum and Baileys Circus, and so this kind of ties about three things together at once, because I recently did a video showing you a mummy that they had from the Wayback Machine in Barnum and Baileys Circus that you could look at, and they did a recreation of that. And that idea, and of course the mermaid thing that we have here. But did you know that whenever you investigate it, they actually mentioned there were a few more of these things that were scattered around somewhere in this same similar area, not Fiji, but Japan, like you see here. And it was kept at a temple as sacred somehow, and that was supposed to lend some type of credence that these things were actually a real mermaid or a mermaid creature, and therefore all these people must have actually taken this, and next thing you know, it was a red-headed or blonde-haired mermaid, half woman, a siren, all these different things that come from it. Well, if you've been with me for a while, you know that there's been a lot of mermaids through time, and we could look at things such as Dagon and Dag, which means fish, and this incredible fish man at one time that we have in folklore and mythology that goes way, way back before any idea of where you would think it would be a Danish people that came up with the story that we have of Little Mermaid, or a better way of describing it is the Danish people were going off of old mythology before this. And it's kind of like the Brothers Grimm or whatever, where you find out some of these folklore tales aren't from the last few hundred years, but go back many thousands of years. So whenever they finally here got hold of this Little Mermaid statuette, there were big questions about what was going on and what is this mermaid? And of course it was kept sacred in a temple and so on. But you can take a look at this and see that there's something definitely odd about this. But of course, viewing it in a mummified state and looking at the way mummies look a lot of times where they're all receded, tried to give it this idea. But instead of being a life-size human type of fish or anything, this thing is under 3 foot if you were able to straighten its tail out. And so something much different than we have over time. And sure, there's ancient tales of Dagon that go back to the first recorded of times, but I've also shown you something special that was shown in a movie years ago about the English patient, and how in North Africa, well before recorded history, there was actually a people that in this cave area had taken and made pictures of whales swimming along with people, and those people had fishtails. I made a video called Mermaids of the Green Sahara. It was pretty cool. I kind of like the idea of where I put 3 and 3 things together and check this all out. But that's been years ago, but I'll show you a picture of that here, and so the reference of where that comes from and the ideal. And so this wasn't something Danish and from the 16 or 14 to 1600s where this mythology and folklore came out and ended up being the idea of the mermaid that we have today. In fact, it goes back many thousands of years. In fact, they realized that this cave art where it's at used to actually have a river running right by it into a giant lake that was there, and other mid-sized and large-sized lakes. And the giant lake, there was giant Lake Chad and so on there. And there's even been whales found, but they predate this up into this time of having been in this area. And archaeologists now are looking back at this again and saying, if it shows this, and they were aquatic at the time doing these type of things, this is actually dating back thousands of years before we give credit for. We've actually taken and radiocarbon dated off things that we found in here, but knowing what we know now, and then whenever this was all flooded in, and when they could have been seeing a whale, even if it came in accidentally and got stuck, and so on, that this dates back thousands of years before that. In fact, somebody started making the comment it could have been 20 or 30,000 years before that, and that there's no way of giving the proof until we go and try to get more carbon dating off the fact, get a piece of rock chip that's just right near it that they know hasn't been ruined over time or changed, and do bioluminescent testing and other things to turn around and go, well, how old was this going on? When did it happen at? And it may need to be revisited, as per se. But there's always been this thing about mermaids. I mean, it's one of the many Caucasian type of mythologies that we still have up into a modern day, along with dragons and other things, which I've always thought was a neat thing as I was a kid. It kind of has been a stringer that's helped keep me going on in all this type of things and studies to find out the reality of what was going on here. But they finally in 2022 got to take a look at this thing in a scientific form, and they figured out that, well, this is kind of like the other one, but yet it's a little bit different. Somebody would say variation on a theme, but in that same breath, they figured out the radiocarbon dating timing on this versus the Fiji Mermaid version of it and everything, and that this is around that same time. And so passed to these people somehow were a mummified fake monkey fish artifact thing, and there are actually 3 or 4 places all on this coast. And of course that leaves people with an ambiguous way to think about where this happens at and where this came from and so on like that. There are stories along with each one of these things that doesn't really correlate to a truth and reality and looks more like folklore. But this Okayama temple here is the one that's been housing it since it had it. And even though they at first were referring to it as being there a long, long time ago, and actually predates this actual temple here, and the wood that's on this temple in reality found out that it was in the 1700s, and we'll look at that here shortly. But after being able to look at this thing, scientists have gotten together, and even including Orientals, so they were in on this, definitely so. And after a little head scratching, and they thought, well, it's got to be a monkey fish thing just like the rest of them, but let's take a full in-depth, we've got that CT technology and so on, what is this all made of, and so on. So after looking at this Kurashiki University of Science and Arts and running through the lab and doing CAT scans and x-rays and things like that, and trying to find out where it is and what it's all made of, they end up coming to find out that, well, the torso, the shoulders and the arms and the face is of a special type of monkey, but the torso is not. The middle portion of its body is made of cloth, other resins, things like that, and pretty much made together with paper mache. And you wouldn't notice this until you got with something like a CAT scan, and you find out that there are fish bones and things like that utilized in it. And the bottom half of it is basically a mappa puffer or a stellata puffer that looks much like this one that's here, that's in those waters and all over the South China Sea and Indian Ocean and so on. But this puffer right here is used where they chopped it off just before the eyes and kept that entire bottom part. The middle part's paper mache, and the top part is made from a local monkey But whenever they checked that with supposedly with a strontium type thing, it's not local from here. It's down in the islands this way here that they find this exact version of monkey or macaque style of monkey that's going on that they're looking at. And so it must have been procured or made somewhere around that idea. And then the idea that the Fiji mermaid came from this same type of source comes to thought, with similar dating that goes on here. So this puffer fish and some other fish bones that are really not named, along with keratin, which is types of horn. It's what our fingernails are made out of, and hair and so on like that. But what they're looking at here is pieces of it made out of horns and so on. So this monkey idea that's here showed up, and whenever they checked it genetically, and then of course the story behind it says that in 1736 this fisherman was out fishing and this thing popped up and started making goo-goo funny faces at him, and he threw a harpoon in it, and that's where they got it from. Try to correlate this back with reality, and it looks like some type of folklore that the religious place has taken on, and it's one thing that they started saying, and then because of that, that's where we get this concept. But when looking through this idea, it really wasn't a mermaid. In fact, this was looked at as being somewhat sacred, and so what they did was they basically put this thing in a glass exhibit, much like the glass exhibit that you saw traipsing around America. Well, you probably never saw it, it was back in the day, but Ripley's Believe It or Not and the Fiji mermaid. And that there are a few more forms of this around, like in Japan, that are showing a commonality that makes connections to a people that was apparently having trade and doing things in the area, and it looks like either passed from folklore or directly by themselves ended up making these fake mummified mermaid type of taxidermy, and they were ended up kept as sacred as being somewhat possibly true. Just like you look in Barnum's museum and they took a man from the waist up and attached it onto a horse where his neck was and tried to give an idea of his centaur. Of course, whenever you look into the concept of a horseman as one word and then break it apart to what it came out of and say a horseman, you can easily conflagrate the idea of these people that were so at one with their horse and all of these things that they became one, that the horse knew what to do and it was like an extension of the man and so on. And you take a few of these things and throw it together, and next thing you know you have a centaur, right? Well, the same thing happens with mermaids. And by the way, Dagon would be a merman, much like you would think of as Neptune or Aquaman, or along this line here, but it's a little different. And when you go through the ancient folklore in each one, you'll find out special things that kind of lead you to make comparisons that start to show you what these people were believing. In fact, in my other video shown about it, I talk about one case where the ancient Phoenicians and Carthaginian type of people had this type of concept, and then you trace it back and you find out there were pearl diving women out there that were said they could swim like a fish, that they could hold their breath longer than any man, and apparently had done this to a point where you could try to go out there and everybody goes underwater at the same time and see who comes up first. And that these mermaids, mer being ocean, mer being a sea, huge body of water, so on. It's where we get mercantile from, but it's also with a whole lot of words that ended up showing you we weren't calling it necessarily ocean or sea, but it's where we get the mer idea, and these ladies of the sea, which really weren't connected necessarily back to pirates and things like that. I mean, they didn't have women on the ships and so on, so what are they talking about here? And in this one situation, there was these ladies that could swim like a fish, that go and get pearl diving, and apparently the other mullets that help make up purple dye. which was special and sacred of the Phoenicians and so on, and we still use it for that concept for royalty today. So it's pretty neat. And I could go on for hours and hours, in fact, just repeat everything that was in that other video, but let's leave that for you watching that other video at some time. In Mermaids of the Green Sahara, it's pretty cool showing here of mermaids not going back this date, that date. Wait, hold on, here's these mermaids of the Green Sahara back whenever it was green and there was water here and so on, and perhaps that should be a little redated. From what I understand, they've, because of all this, turned around and said, well, we should look into that. But here we are something like 8 years later, and I haven't heard they even went out there and took a second look from this point. So apparently a lot of this is built on funding ideas. But this Fiji mermaid is also reflected in a Japan mermaid. But this Japan mermaid is actually mimicking what we know of as the Fiji mermaid, and there was decreed to be a few more of them, but whenever they did so, Barnum and Bailey actually just got this one, and then that was good enough. And apparently they paid a whole lot of money or gave a whole lot of product, cargo, whatever you want to try to call it, for this endeavor. And it was been able to done at Fiji, but not in Japan here. It was always kept sacred. And then in the modern day, people went in there and looked at it, saw it again, and said, you know, that's a fish monkey thing. We need to take a look at that. And they finally broke down enough to say, well, let's take a look at it. I mean, it's non-invasive, right? All you're doing is taking this in there, running it through a CAT scan, bringing it back. And that's all you need to do. Well, that and a couple of little pinches out of here, here, and here to figure out DNA, what's going on. Because we know it's a monkey thing, but we might be able to know exactly what kind of monkey this is. And we might also figure out what the tail is made of and that kind of fish. And lo and behold, now they've figured it out. And the middle part is actually made of paper mache and so on, very much like the Fiji mermaid. And so all of these connections actually show something else. But I think it's pretty neat, you know, believing in mermaids and so on. It goes back to the Minoan times when people believe that. They also believe that dolphins, in their intelligence and wanting to deal with humans and so on like that, were actually people that went through some mythological state and ended up people turned into dolphins. There's even old Bible midrash that says that whenever the Nephilim went away, that they got turned into a mermaid type, and that's why they didn't die with everybody else in the flood that was supposed to kill everybody except for Noah and his Caucasian kids here that heralded civilization in 3 different areas, which I've got other videos on the reality of such. But in that idea, they even in a biblical, not straight in the Bible that you see it there, but in a midrash say they turned into that, and therefore fish don't die in the super flood. Apparently they didn't have to have aquariums on the ark for situations. They're not even really referred to because it's easy to understand, you know, fish, water got more, big deal. So that's also the reason that mermaids were able to live on. And then you say mermaid, hold on, you're talking about also the sirens of old and so on like that, and it makes connections through mythologies of different people and their thoughts, again going back to Dagon and this mermaid man that I'll probably show you a picture of, and then lo and behold there's cave art drawing of people with fishtails going back in the Wayback Machine. Let me know what you think down below. I just thought I'd share this with you because, well, we got about 2 or 3 things attached into one, and of course the local mermaid, or the new mermaid movie that's been shown out where they just race swap a person in there, and oh, of course she doesn't need the man and change her 3 days. She lost her voice, the whole 9 yards. They had to take that off and make her a strong woman mermaid. But peace.